Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney.
And Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice. Welcome to today's podcast episode on how to create vitality with our special guest, Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa. Do you want to know how to create vitality through simple daily choices? What does a sustainable lifestyle mean? And how do you actually make a sustainable lifestyle happen without depleting your energy currency? Our intention for today is to talk with a very special guest, Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa, about the answer to these questions and more. How creativity itself contributes to vitality and sustainability, what Ayurvedic medicine is, and how one practices culinary medicine with specialties in plant and lifestyle medicine. So at the beginning of each episode, I invite all of you to take a pause with me. If it's safe for you to do so, you can close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you, inviting you to settle into this time together with Dr. Khalsa, allowing the brain and the body to be together at the same place at the same time. Inviting your full presence, your attention to what's being shared today during this episode. And as you're ready, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in. So thank you so much, Siri Chand, for being here. You are an integrative healer that I have really been inspired by. I really am grateful that you're here and for all of the sharing and wisdom and just light that you bring to this world. You also have additional training in Ayurvedic and culinary medicine, amongst many other accolades. So I'm going to give you the opportunity now to share a bit about your journey in being a healer.
Well, thank you. And I'm so grateful to be here. It's such a beautiful podcast and intentionality that's gone into the creation of this community. So just acknowledging the gracious invitation. And I'll open with just maybe a few minutes just talking about, well, how did I get to 52? Just kind of this unique equation. And I think the fundamental tenet beneath that is that I'm just a naturally very curious person. I like to call myself a lifelong learner, and I'll probably, until my last breath, be learning something because just in my nature, one could say, can you cultivate that? Probably. If it's not your nature, that's okay too. But I definitely recognize that learning and exploring and self healing has been a primary driving force of my adult life. And it really started in my pre-med years when I like to say I had like a mini nervous breakdown. um, the pre-med time, I had come from, at that time, the number one high school in the country and public high school. And it was very high stress science and math magnet school in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And it's like a pressure cooker. You go to college, the expectation is that in high school, starting in 8th grade, you're already thinking about what you're going to do after college, what profession, law, engineering, doctor. So by the time I got to college, I was already pretty frazzled. And I think actually these days, it's fair to say that we have a lot more openness about being able to talk about that. But in those days, boy, it was just a sign of weakness. And so I didn't talk about it. I didn't tell anyone. I just internalized all those feelings and kept marching forward. Well, bodies do what bodies are going to do when we do that. And I had kind of like not a mental breakdown, but a physical breakdown. I stopped functioning properly. I couldn't digest food. I couldn't sleep. My cycle stopped. It was just all these things at once. And I went to the student health clinic, and I always say it's like divine timing. The gentleman who met me there was probably someone not so interested in helping stressed out undergraduates. And he said, here is phenobarbital, and take this and you'll feel better. And for those of you that don't know, phenobarbital is a very potent tranquilizer, basically used in veterinary medicine. I don't know very many physicians that have used it outside of the neurology field. So in essence, that was my internal, just outrageous enough for me to say, well, maybe there's another way. And I'd grown up in a very standard American household where mindfulness, yoga, metaphysical study, herbal healing wasn't part of our vernacular. And at the same time, there was a lot of love and values for healthy eating, movement. And I think that was sort of the platform that I sprung out and forward from. And I ended up in a small metaphysical bookstore in Charlottesville that's now closed called Quest, and aptly so began took a semester off, began diving into all kinds of abstract theories that were like, I'd read them and I'd say, that makes sense. Finally, something makes sense. Like, we're not just chasing disease, we're looking for deeper roots of healing. And that's when I was introduced to Tai Chi, Qigong, yoga, plant-based eating. At that time, it was Moosewood Cookbook. For those of you oldies and goldies in the audience, it was not a media era. Vegetarian cookbooks were not a dime a dozen. So there were a handful of ones that were sort of the one everyone learned to cook from, natural food cooking, basically. And from that point forward, I really had a parallel path of continuing to integrate scientific knowledge with a master's degree, undergraduate education in biology, master's degree in master's of science in biology, and then medical school at EVMS, and then residency at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville. And then from there, at the same time, though, I was always learning and incorporating other modalities of healing because it interested me. Why do we get sick, and how do we stay well? And pivoting all the way into many years of sort of clinical care, I finally decided one day that I would take another chunk of big time off to dedicate to those studies, and to spend the better part of 3 years studying with Dr. Vasant Lad, who's a beautiful luminary teacher of Ayurveda. I finished that. I then completed the Integrative Medicine Fellowship and Lifestyle Medicine certification. So I hold board certifications in integrative, palliative, lifestyle, and internal medicine. And I have maintained all of them in spite of what has been a considerable arc with COVID and a lot of a mysterious illness, you might say, starting in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. So I always say there was sort of the academic phase, there was the practical phase, there was the deeply integrative phase where I was pulling in these other modalities, and then there was the self-healing phase. And so I feel like I'm sort of emerging out of that period of life, and I'm not sure which chapter we're going into at this point, but it's been a pretty amazing blessing to have been exposed to so many different philosophies of healing. And that curiosity is my superpower. I think that's maybe a Brene Brown quote, but basically it allows me to invite in a yes and, as opposed to saying, well, there's no evidence for it. I've long dropped there's no evidence for it conversation. Perhaps we're not sophisticated enough to study. Perhaps the evidence is there. We just haven't actually looked at it practically. Or even perhaps it doesn't look like the way we thought it would, in the sense that there can be healing without cure. And so I think it's a very interesting also dilemma for me that I stay so open to exploration. And I always like to lament with people that it'd be very difficult to freak me out in some sort of healing modality. I have probably done it, tried it, heard about it, explored it, talked to people who've done it. So I think there's a lot of merit in many different systems of approaching how to maintain health, how to return to health.
Wow, Siri Chand, I didn't know that the parallel learning started so young in your career. And you spoke about two times where you basically took like a learning sabbatical, if you will. What was that like? What was the process of deciding that? Because that obviously um, was not linear and was not expected in the quote unquote standard medical training pathway for many allopathically trained healers.
Yeah. Well, and to just to segue that, I think it's really been three when I really think about it. So the first break was I had 4 years between undergrad and med school, which in 1998 was not that common,
Right.
meaning a gap year or years was like kiss of death. Like, how could you think that that would be okay? But what had happened for me is that when I took that break in undergrad, I had enough AP credit, I graduated on time. I I was like, "Ah, I'm free. I'm not going to be a doctor. It's such a cumbersome path. Thank God I graduated." And then the healer in me, it was like a relentless voice that said, "By the way, I think you need to be a healer."
Mhm.
And so then I investigated acupuncture schools. I didn't know as much about Ayurveda then. For me, Ayurveda was still very new. Certainly there weren't schools that I was aware of. It turns out Dr. Ladd would have been available at that time, but it was a very tiny institution in the mid 90s. So went to the naturopathic schools. I went to acupuncture schools. I looked at massage schools. I finished doing some of the healing that had happened from just being so stressed out as an undergraduate. And then I sort of backed my way into a master's degree. Someone had said, "Why don't you think about this?" And then I said, "Well, gosh, maybe I could go to med school." I had gotten nearly a 4.0 in my master's degree. And then I said, "Well, let me sit down and study for the MCATs." And I miraculously got in the top 10%. And so I had these amazing MCAT scores, a 4.0, a master's degree nearly, and then this like very low lying fruit for the undergrad GPA. It was like 3.2 or something. And because I had deliberately failed a couple of classes to kind of sabotage the medical pathway,
Mhm.
it was a very complicated time. I was really intent on not going into the traditional pathway. But as luck would have it, I was living in Norfolk, where I had done my master's degree, and there were people at the med school who were familiar with my work and me as a person. And I always say I wrote this very forthright essay that basically said, I want to do integrative medicine. I want to work as a coach. I want to work with acupuncturists and nutritionists and mind, body, spirit wellness. And I wrote that essay as sort of my last hurrah. I said, if they take me, then it's a divinely ordered journey. And if they don't, I'm free at last. I'm free to, step away. So I've always had a sort of push-pull with the traditional pathway because it is for a very sensitive person, it's quite toxic. It is just naturally weighs in your spirit. It interferes with lifestyle measures that would maintain health for someone who has a lot of empathic sensitivity.
Mhm.
But they took me. And so, and then inevitably matched into the Mayo Clinic program, which was very rigorous and prestigious, and kind of buried a lot of that part of myself. And when I finished, I actually moved to Tucson and worked in hospice and palliative medicine in Phoenix. And I had a number of cases in hospice where I realized, like, wow, life is short. And I did hospice because I didn't have any parameters around visit length. This was always my big beef with organized medicine, and I never quite had the bandwidth to build my own practice.
Mhm.
Kind of a shame when I look back. Coaching would have been so incredible for me, but it didn't really, I didn't know where to find it at that point.
Mhm.
So I did hospice and palliative medicine for many years. And then I had a series of patients that just reminded me of how life is shorter than you think,
Yeah.
and you better hop into that. So I always say I just had this sort of unmet invitation to go study with Dr. Ladd. So in 2011 is when I took that long break. And of course, people said, just like the break then, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing?" And I was kind of like, if it's meant to be that I come back, then fine, it will be. But always there's a part of me that's been looking for something of an exit strategy, especially once I understood the impact of corporate interests and venture capitalism as it relates to how physicians are viewed in the large schema of practices these days,
Mhm.
which was quite sad for me. And of course, healing requires intervention and time and prevention as well. And so we don't, uh, larger systems are coming to understand that, but certainly, 2010, we're still grappling with all these transitions from privately owned practices to large group practices where you're just sort of a number, and your personality, your intentions, your unique gifts are much harder to channel. And I never really wanted to do academic medicine because I didn't like the hospital, and internal medicine always involved hospital rotations. It was always their non-negotiables. If you come do academic internal medicine, you have to rotate through the hospital. And that was a hard no for me.
Mhm.
So that was the second break. And then the third one has probably been the formal exit strategy from the clinical pathway, but that was more forced because of I got very sick with COVID in February 2020 and got it two more times, and then have developed sort of that mysterious array of inflammatory autoimmune conditions that have taken a very long time to heal. But gratefully, I always say I could be so much worse off if I hadn't had all the other tools I've been using. And so slowly returning to what feels like health. It's still a little tenuous at times, but definitely my long COVID journey is primarily punctuated with neurologic issues. So dysautonomia, POTS, a lot of digestive issues because of gastric slowing and SIBO. So it was really very difficult to unravel. And it coincided with menopause, which was a beautiful, very complicated, and apparently this particular, I like to say it's the Gen X high achieving type A menopause. Long COVID is a very particularly well-known persona in the medical literature at this point because they've just been slammed by it. And I think there's a variety of factors from trauma to career burnout to the world we live in to the onslaught of technology that happened really at the pivot in our lifetime. In ninth, 10th grade is when we transitioned over to technology. So there were a lot of transitions that I feel those of us in that Gen X continuum have sort of stood in. And so it's very complicated, and that they believe there's some mitochondrial issues that are linked into that. And so it's kind of fascinating, but I visited the long COVID clinic in Rochester, and that's kind of what they explained to me. Like, yes, you are fitting a very particular persona that we are seeing, and it's the array of symptoms are different, but the massive pause that was required in life has been very similar.
Thank you so much for being so open about every aspect of your journey and being vulnerable. And in your presence now in 2024, I mostly know of you from the Andrew Weil Integrative Medicine program. You taught some parts of it when I was in fellowship, so thank you for that. And then also your social media presence, where the beautiful pictures of food and the recipes that you are presenting have been such a sort of light in this otherwise, I feel like, very go, 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 productivity oriented, or look at me type of environment that I all too often sometimes find myself in the social media realm. So can you talk a little bit about your culinary medicine expertise and where that relates to your current journey right now, and also your own healing path?
Yeah. So I think for one of the things that I learned at that segue in college was that food was actually medicine. It was an important part. And I did a bunch of different random diets and tried different things. And then from that point forward, I just started digging in. But there's an even earlier sort of glimmer of what was coming, which was that well, now I'm really dating myself, but in the 70s on Saturday, there was only four channels. It was, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. And PBS on Sundays had great chefs of Europe on. Someone in the audience may remember there would be The Cook's Busy, grainy film, and there would be a European narrator. The chef has done this. That was what I watched on Saturday mornings. I've never liked being silly. I know it seems kind of random, but cartoons drive me bananas. Never liked them, don't like watching them. And so I had found these cooking shows were just sort of, so I'm like in the kitchen at 7, 8 years old, 9 years old, 10 years old. And of course, classic sort of Gen X joking aside, we were latchkey kids. You come home, both parents are working, really the first generation where that's more universally true. And my brother and I did a lot of our own meal planning and making growing up. And my dad would help and mom would help, but there was sort of a natural desire. And then as I got into my early years, I realized that I loved expensive, fancy food, but I could make it myself if I paid attention. Because I had had all this culinary training, if you will, from these TV shows and then going in and practicing. And there was a Time series books that were like great chefs of Japan, great chefs of Norway. And then I would get the recipes. And really, a recipe is a mindfulness exercise. If you follow recipes, the dish should come out. Like it's not, I know I don't want to belittle anyone's journeying with cooking, but generally, if the recipe's well written and we're mindfully attentive to it, it should result in, now maybe not as pretty as the photo, but like the amalgam. And then I just kept taking cooking classes. And just for clarification, there is a formal culinary medicine certification process that I haven't elected to do. I think I just sort of maxed out the additional training budget. I think I'd like to do it and like to be part of that community. So I always like to distinguish people who've done the formal training and certification. But what I realized very early on when I started teaching at the fellowship in 2006 was that I wanted to bring food with me, that the food was also the teacher. The preparation techniques, the quality of the food mattered, where we get it, how we sourced it. And with that, people started asking for recipes. Well, how did you make that? And I always say food talks to me. So being at a market where I've been fortunate enough to live in warmer climates, so Phoenix for 17 years and now Santa Barbara, I live in places where we have year-round farmers market, which is incredible for me. Like that's a priority. I'm hoping I can always afford to live in places where there's year-round growing seasons. And I certainly recognize that that's not an opportunity for everyone, but I like to eat seasonally and I go to the market. It's integrated into my week. I converse with the vegetables and the fruit. We bring it home and then it kind of alchemizes in my spirit with skills and flavors. And I have good smell memory, which is slightly unique skill that I think some chefs have. And so then the recipes sort of emerge. It's never anything I've concretely planned. It's more just what's in the fridge, what's fresh. And from the Ayurvedic perspective, where's my digestion? Where's my health? What kind of support? Because there are gradations of like, well, it's going to taste good, but it's going to be heavier, or this is going to be light and savory and easy to digest. And maybe I need a break from eating heavier or sort of a mini fasting kind of quality to it. And that minute to minute, moment to moment relationship is something I think others can cultivate, but we don't get any guidance in it. We don't get any inspiration in it. And my husband for years has called my social media my art therapy. And I would say that I'm in the process of sort of, you know, the the arduous for those who have made a transition out of clinical of like, okay, how do I turn something that's been largely joyful and artistic into something that might be able to generate some income for me, being the age that I am, not working in clinical medicine, of course, is a significant financial issue. I still even have student loans. So, you know, just because I'm not in the clinical pathway, there isn't necessarily an influx of ways to earn a similar salary. So it has been a fun journey. But when I started at the fellowship, I was giving food samples and creating recipes and slide decks. And then it grew into a blog. And then it just has become, I guess you could just say, my conversation with the plants and their desire to be seen in their beauty. And so I have a dear friend who said to me many, many years ago, and I really took it to, excuse me, to heart, which was something to the effect of, we don't necessarily need another book telling us what to eat, what not to eat, but, and you can do that, but maybe something that inspires beauty, inner creativity, and inner ignition of Agni or awareness in the beauty of it. Because it's not like, I'm not kind of totally into it to be a food influencer, so to speak, in the classic sense. If one was to compare me to some of the bigger cookbook blogs, there's something deeper in it for me, which is sparking healing and potential for people to see beauty, to explore beauty, to relate to plants in a different way, to see them the way I see them, which they're exquisite. Like there's no other, like years, 15, 20 years of taking photos of plants. They never cease to be interesting to me. They never stop sharing their unique phytonutrients, their fibers, their patterns. I sometimes also think about the hands that grew them and cultivated them and brought them with, I try to generate gratitude in a sort of more cosmic level for these things that exist. And I think that that's been such an important, just an important thing. So,
Well, definitely the beauty and light, and I want to say also bringing in the vitality that you speak of on your website, in all of the photos and all of the reels that you share with us. And so, can you share a little bit more about how food and sustainability can take part in our vitality as living beings?
well, one of the things that I could just jump right into with that is that our we're all probably over consuming.
Mhm.
And I say that with a lot of self-compassion, meaning I am doing it as are many others. And though it is very complex to look at the obesity epidemic, there are some central themes we could actually incorporate. And one of them is this idea of what are we consuming and why are we consuming too much of it? And because that ties directly into sustainability. And by that, I mean the reallocation of the resources that are so readily available for Americans. We're talking about sustainability on a planetary level. And I think that um, I think of it in an Ayurvedic quality that vitality is like a very steady home fire.
Mhm.
So if you, those of you on the East Coast who may be listening can relate to, if you visited um, the like Williamsburg or some of the historic re I don't know what the right word is. They kind of show how people lived historically in settler or colonial times, which we know has its own bevy of dilemmas. But when you would visit these places growing up, you would see that the fire was a central part of the home. And we don't have a relationship to fire in the same way that basically man has had forever. And the interesting facet in that for me is that I always wanted gas stoves. And people would say, oh, gas is better for controlling heat. And for me, it was something else. And I think for me, it was really about this relationship to fire and the transformation of food by fire.
Mhm.
And so you go to these older, I don't know I can't think of the word at the moment, but you go to these older settler reenactments, how they lived in the colonial homes. And there's a big central fire, and they would have the bellows, right? They'd fan the embers. And then they would add the kindling in the morning, the fire would rise. And then as the evening came, the fire would come to embers, and we'd let it sit through the night. And my relationship to this conceptually from Ayurveda, this is a very Ayurvedic principle, is that our own digestive capacity mirrors this movement through time.
Mhm.
And because of that, and we know this now in circadian rhythm science, but I'm not going to dive into that. But we see this rhythm of sort of tending the fire in the morning with a morning light, going out for the walk, eating light, fasting after we get up, particular timing to coffee, eating the larger meal in the midday, not eating once the sun goes down. There's Dr. Patel at the Salk Institute, his work is really centered around this. So we see this, that it results in more rhythmic neurohormonal regulation, microbiome, many other features, probably autonomic function. So it's really fascinating to me to think about. There's this very nature of tending the inner fire that we don't have a cosmic relationship to anymore. So we're kind of always putting wood on a small fire. And from the Ayurvedic perspective, this diminishes vitality. But if we think about tending the fire so that that flame is steady and consistent, meaning if the embers are low or gentle in the morning, we don't necessarily have a huge breakfast, but maybe your fire wakes up going. So this is an individual inner knowing. So this quality of tending our inner fire, which is probably predicated on emotions, biochemistry, autonomic function, sleep patterns, circadian rhythm, so many things that likely science will get to the other side of perhaps some generations after us. That quality is how vitality is built. And this is a very central principle in Ayurveda is tending Agni or managing the inner fire. And the best analogy I can usually give people is these older homes that had a fire they had to tend to through the day, and they knew can't throw certain wood on the fire if it's wet sapwood or it's just rained. You have to let it dry by the fire. So there's a very conscious relationship to timing of meals and quality of food and quantity of food, and then also allowing that parasympathetic rest and digest reflexive process to come online when we're ready to eat. So that weaving of all of that is probably the central way. It's probably the most important thing, though I love organic, locally grown produce. I believe one can definitely achieve a similar level of vitality through maintaining this inner relationship to digestion, assimilation, absorption, utilization of what we bring in, and that the prominence doesn't have to be, unless it's, of course, just the standard American diet, which is very difficult for that fire to process, right? We're thinking about all the excess that comes in. So with, some sadly high percentage, I'm not sure it's over 50, I'm not sure where it's at this point, of the average American in a pre-metabolic state, we are not digesting both our food and our lives, right? There's an emotional component to Agni that is probably a little more abstract than some of your more scientific listeners would care to correlate, but there is that element of undigested emotional states as well. I think the combination of excess consumption, unresolved emotional inner blocking, heaviness, that combination is sort of what weighs many of our vitality to not be present. But the inner work, the self-exploration, mindfulness builds Agni, builds inner clarity, helps clear emotional stagnation. All of that kind of creates this very complicated cycle. But through that, is how I see vitality emerging. And that's a very long answer to your question, and I hope it made sense.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the fire, the inner knowing of your own hearth, if you will, like the inner hearth,
That's the word.
right?
That's what I
Hearth
was looking for. Yeah.
um, of ourselves, our life force, the chi, all of those words come to mind. And then as you spoke, um, the importance of maintaining the hearth and the embers and the ongoing flame is also really determined by how much space there is,
Yes.
right? Like within the wood itself, you spoke about heaviness and the SAD diet, the unfortunate standard American diet with the acronym of SAD, and how heavy that is. And perhaps there's not enough space in
Yeah.
that heaviness where you're thinking about consuming might be more beneficial to your vitality. That's not always the case, especially with the standard American diet. You actually need space and intentionality and this inner knowing and the relationship with food um, that is much more close to the earth.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. That's such a brilliant kind of carrying forward of what I was talking about, because space is the feeling of spaciousness, I think, is what gives, I'm going to be very abstract, but from the Ayurvedic standpoint, it creates the container the fire can live in.
Mhm.
So Akash or ether is space, and spaciousness, creating more space in our being for big, complicated emotions like grief or um, sorting out trauma history. We have to create space in our daily schedule, in our being. I could list them all to allow for that alchemization of things that have been difficult passages for whatever the reason. And life is, they say, but basically life is suffering. Life is going to bring you the hardship, hopefully not trauma, but inevitably some people in today's world also have an experience of trauma from varying different reasons. So I think we have to really take into account that spaciousness, that hearth, if you will. What did you say, hearth? That
Mhm.
word is like escaping me. This is part of the COVID piece. The word finding is so weird. But that hearth is something that requires someone to sweep the mantle of. It requires someone to blow gently into that space. It requires someone to watch it. It's happening to the fire. If it's barking at you, we need to close the doors or diminish the air supply. Like, it can kind of go both ways, right? The fire can rise, and that's in Ayurveda, we say that's when we're internal heat is high, we're aggravated, we're hangry. There's all these features that can kind of swing the fire into different ways. Is there a fan on the fire? Do some people don't like sitting under an air conditioning or fan unit because their internal fire is so affected by movement? So again, I know these are more abstract for clinicians that have taken a very standard Western approach to their study and to their own conceptualization. But my feeling on these notions and ideas: pay attention.
Mhm.
Ayurveda was built on paying attention. It was basically 2,000 plus years of observing the human condition. It's not extrapolated from, say, recent eras where it's this lab or that biochemical pathway or perhaps this thing or that thing with big promises. It was millennia of people observing and taking notes and passing on what they learned until there was a body of knowledge large enough to put into textbooks and organized into some sort of clinical, uh, deeply vast, broad area of study. And there's piles of very technical Sanskrit textbooks in Ayurveda that merit our curiosity, I feel, at the very least.
And before I forget, with the space metaphor, air is in space and spaciousness, and we need air for fires, right? That's a
Exactly.
key ingredient of it. Wow, I feel like we could just go on, and I'm loving this all, but I wanted to ask if there was anything that you wanted to share with our listeners that might help with finding their own vitality, getting curious about their vitality, how to sustain it.
I think that, and I did allude to this kind of at the beginning of the conversation, but curiosity may end up being one of the most important pieces of this. And by that, I want to invite you to start paying attention to a couple of things. Your morning, how do you wake up and feel? Do you feel heavy? Do you feel light? Do you feel energized? When you go to bed at night, are you falling asleep in exhaustion, or are you taking a few minutes to wind down? Are you tired and exhausted after eating? Do you have a normal sort of well-formed bowel movement, or do you strain? Do you feel creative and resourced? Do you feel a bevy of emotions that have no room to be expressed? These kind of inventories can be sort of an internal dialogue. You can even have a little checklist for yourself and sort of say, and then try an intervention that's relatively in its own way innocuous or not harmful, but try a series of mindfulness exercises. Try a ginger tea before a meal or in between meals. Try walking in the early morning sun. Take a look at various interventions that are lifestyle oriented. Implement, create a community of friends and have a monthly dinner, and be surprised what happens with your sleep. Keep track of your interventions. If you can't do them nimbly in your head, which is a little tougher for me now, keep a little log of things you've tried and what the outcomes are. And stay curious when you have an unexpected outcome based on what would be seemingly a positive intervention. And learn from that. Try to figure out, what did I do different that gave me this funny, paradoxical outcome? Could have been something I ate 2 days ago, could have been a rainy day, could have been harsh words with my significant other. Start getting curious, and you'll start to see what I call energy currency, meaning, do you have a anabolic life or a catabolic life? And we want to sort of be just in the middle, where we're not spending more energy every day than we have, and we're not sort of holding on to energy that we need to spend. And it's a very moment by moment, day by day. And unfortunately, medicine likes to give an algorithm of every day do this, but true vitality is rooted in anything but that in a pragmatic sense. I mean, we need to incorporate teeth brushing, wind down routines, movement, but every day is actually going to give us a really different set of variables.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa, for sharing your journey and your wisdom. You have given our listeners so much to think about, and hopefully invigorated and fanned the embers of curiosity, um, to try different aspects within lifestyle medicine and Ayurveda to include in their own healing journey. And with that, how can we get a hold of you if the listeners want to learn more about you?
Absolutely. You can just Google Dr. DOCTOR Siri, SIRICHAND, or at Dr. Siri Chun, spelled out, all of them. And I'm on pretty much every social media platform. I also have a Facebook group specifically oriented towards cooking and just sort of resources as I come across them. I know people need sometimes moment by moment inspiration, seasonal ideas. So I share a lot in that as well.
And we will make sure to include all of those links in our show notes. And with that, I am going to invite Siri Chan to lead us in a mindful moment practice. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes, and please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, We would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely.
Thank you, everyone. And so we're just going to do a very basic breathing pranayama exercise that is one of my favorites. And to do so, we just let the eyes sort of gently close. And if you're driving, we'll have you do this later. And if you're sitting, we're going to let the feet root into the ground and comfortably adjust the sacrum. And see if you can notice to center the head over the neck, perhaps even leaning back just a little, letting the shoulders drop, letting the palms come upward in the lap, and just taking a moment of noticing the breath. We're going to inhale and notice the coolness of the breath as we inhale through the nostrils, keeping the mouth closed, and the warmth of the air as we exhale. And I'm going to invite you to follow the air, the coolness of the air as it enters the lungs, letting the belly expand, and then bringing the diaphragm back towards the spine, gently exhaling and noticing the warmth of the air. I'd like you to just do this at a pace that feels comfortable for you. Just noticing the coolness with the inhale and the warmth with the exhale. And just remembering the breath is always with us. Perhaps noticing any spot on the body that feels warm or tingly, and bringing the breath to that space. And again, exhaling. Now, gently, we're just bringing the breath back, awareness to the inhale and exhale. And we're going to gently rub the hands together, creating just a little bit of friction, a little bit of warmth. And we're going to place the palms over the eyes and just rest here for a moment, noticing perhaps as we cover the eyes, the shoulders relaxing. And again, a big inhale, and as you exhale, a big sigh. One more. And just keeping the eyes closed, gently bringing the palms back, fluttering the eyelids open, and shaking the fingers a little. Moving the shoulders and just recognizing that just a 2 to 3 minute practice can totally bring us into a state of very deep relaxation by merely engaging deeply with the breath. So I want to thank everyone for joining me for the practice and also for the invitation to share more about my journey. What a delight to spend this time with you today.
Deep bow of gratitude, Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa, for all the sharing and the beautiful practice and all that you are and bring to this world.